I'm going to talk about a research project that I've been working with together. That I've been working with my PhD student at the U of A in the iSchool, David City. We call it TD Chain. So you can already imagine it's going to be about blockchain, but it's the one application of blockchain that I actually found super useful besides what it was created for, which is for digital currency, of course. So I'm going to talk about trust via transparency. So first, I should probably talk about the different meanings of trust, because I would imagine that the audience is pretty varied. So some meanings of trust are different across different disciplines. So in the social sciences in general, we tend to think of trust as willingness to be vulnerable towards others. So we accept the risks that we might incur some costs if the other person basically betrays our trust. In more computational social science or computer and information science, trust in a system is actually not always a positive thing. Basically, we have trust in a system when no one in the system really needs to be trusted. So we don't have to rely on the benevolence of the other players, in order to trust a system. And the good thing about transparency is that it increases both interpretations of trust. So on the one hand, transparency, like Marcus explained, it's sort of like a signal for openness, and it applies to a bunch of different contexts, government, organizational leadership. And on the aspect of, computer and information science, transparency gives other people control and makes the actors accountable for their actions. And so it increases trust on both dimensions. There are some boundary conditions, of course. It's not always the case that transparency increases trust. People have done some experiments regarding trust in government, and it turns out that if the government is too open, it also shows its weaknesses. And so some people observe their trust decrease in government if there is too much openness. And there's also some very good work in trust towards algorithms and trust towards artificial intelligence that suggests that it's better for algorithms to be open and understandable, so that users have some information about how they work, but not too much. So there are some limits to where transparency works for or against trust. What happens in the digital world is that, unfortunately, there's lots and lots of information asymmetries, and I'm going to focus specifically on the data market. Exchanges of data between consumers, brokers, companies, third parties. The consumer is often left in the dark as to how the digital data market really works. So companies exchange and use data for profit. And even though sometimes this happens in the dark, consumers are often willing to share their data for a bunch of different reasons. It's convenient. It's because we like personalized and customized products. Maybe we can get discounts. So lots of reasons why we might be still willing to exchange or participate in this data exchange, even if we don't really know how it actually works. But we are not really 100% aware of the data that we're providing. So we participate in this market, which is a little bit dark to us, because it has benefits, but at the same time, maybe we are not necessarily aware of all of the risks that are involved in data sharing. So this new economy seems to be hidden to the eyes of the consumers. And this is where transparency comes in. It would be great to have a much more transparent data market, but there are issues with creating a transparent data market. It's often hard and sometimes even impossible for the consumer itself to pinpoint value of their own personal data. There may be issues regarding returns to scale. We don't really know how much our data is worth once we already provided some. And also, there are contracts that are very difficult to write in the digital world. We interact sometimes silently with a lot of different providers, and it's difficult to write, read, or enforce contracts. For instance, privacy policies, which are obviously used by the majority of the companies. I would say all digital companies now have privacy policies, but they're difficult to understand for the consumer, and it's really difficult to enforce. And there's also lots of other reasons, but I guess one of the reasons that I want to focus on is that companies really have no incentive to be more transparent, to create a more transparent data market. The data market works perfectly for companies as it is now. So some people have suggested just to focus on regulatory solutions, and this is essentially what the European Union has been trying to do in the last few years. GDPR went into action in May of 2018, and it essentially provides some laws and regulation as to what companies can collect, how they have to communicate about data collection and data use of their consumers, and so on and so forth. But we know that this is not enough, because at least if you've experienced, I'm currently in Europe, but if you've experienced visiting any website from Europe, you will know that there is a bunch of pop-up banners now that come and ask you to over and over to place cookies on your machine, to allow for the placement of cookies on your machine. So this solution doesn't really work, because still it puts all the responsibility of the choice onto the user, and it doesn't really protect privacy or data privacy in any way. There are self-regulatory approaches, which is essentially what the US has been doing since the beginning of the commercial internet with privacy policies, but I've already mentioned all of the issues associated with privacy policies. A lot of us would like to believe that technology can solve all of these problems. Like Marcus said, not all of them. But at least technology can increase transparency of the data market. These are just some of the tools that are available to the user. And today I want to talk about one more, which is indeed blockchain, or a public ledger. Blockchain has been used in a bunch of different scenarios and contexts for health-related data, for block trace, and for essentially for specific file transfers and looking at the history of files. For data transfers with no incentive to companies, though, to be transparent about them. And so here comes the idea of what we call TD chain, or transparent data chain. The idea here is that whenever a company collects data from the user and shares it with third parties, they have the opportunity, the option, to write this transaction on a blockchain, basically declare, I received this data from so-and-so, remaining it obviously encrypted, so private information is protected, and then I'm going to share it with these other parties. You can see here in this graph, there is a data holder, let's say a subject, who wants to provide data to a broker, a company. But before doing that, they can decide whether or not they want to provide that data by looking at their reputation on how they treat the data that they receive, that the company receives. So the company has an opportunity here when they receive data from the data holder to share it with third parties, B2 and B3, and therefore to write a transaction on a blockchain that says, I am now sharing this data with B2 and B3. Essentially, the TD chain will be a chain. It will sort of look like a tree where the user can see exactly who the company that they share data with is going to share data towards third parties. So there's also a score that TD chain assigns to companies. In here, you have an example. A score is 45 out of 100, and essentially talks about how concerned the company is about protecting the data of the user. Now, this data holder now can decide whether or not they like the company that is requesting their data, can decide whether or not they want to provide the data to the company, or to go to some other company, maybe who competes on privacy, indeed, who is better privacy protective, and therefore choose a different provider. So a system like this is immutable because it uses blockchain and strong encryption, and it rests on decentralized trust. So there is no unique central authority that is basically running the writings of the transaction of the blockchain. And so it's decentralized, and it allows to verify the integrity of the transactions. Also, there is a reputation management embedded in this system, because we provide a scale from 0 to 100 about how privacy protective the company is. There's high transparency, which allows companies to easily comply with regulations such as, for instance, the GDPR, but more recently, even the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. And also on the side of the consumer, they can be informed about where their personal data goes and whether or not they want to participate with this particular company. So there are obviously incentives for companies because individuals are more willing to provide good, accurate data if they trust the system, if it's a transparent system. Also, they have an opportunity to build good reputation, so good data management practices and easy compliance with existing regulation. Also for individuals, obviously there is a reduction in the information asymmetry about the data market, and they have sort of like a data dashboard, we call it. So a tree that essentially shows them exactly what their data is going to, where their data is going to go. Obviously, there are limitations to DD chain. DD chain is an incentive scheme. It does not enforce the writings on the chain. So it's not like when a company transmits data to a third party, a smart contract sends a message to the blockchain and immediately inscribes the transaction on the blockchain. It's something voluntary that companies can voluntarily do. Similar systems that enforce writings are easy to break. And so we believe that they're not going to work. And it's designed obviously mainly for forms that contain sensitive data, but it's easy to add dynamic data such as browsing behavior and so on and so forth. So stopping data flows is not realistic, and frankly, it's not beneficial either because the data market helps both companies and consumers. Regulating data flows without providing good incentives is not as effective as we would have hoped. We have seen this from the GDPR. So the TD chain is sort of our suggested solution to reach that sweet spot between privacy fundamentalists who would never share anything and regulators who would want us to share everything.